London, England, July 1888. 2 months before the horrific Whitechapel killing spree began, an American named Francis Tumblety arrived in the city, although this was not his first trip to London. For more than a decade, Tumblety had sold a number of medicinal remedies in both the United States and England, and had also claimed to be a doctor and treated numerous patients, in spite of the fact that he was not a licensed physician and had no formal medical training. And there are those who believe that this dishonest, self-proclaimed doctor was, in fact, Jack the Ripper.
Francis Tumblety, he was an American so-called Indian herb doctor. In other words, he basically was a quack who went around selling alleged remedies, cure-alls, and preying on the gullible. And he was over in London during the time of the Ripper murders.
Tumblety was horribly misogynistic. It seems that early in his life, he had married young, found out later that the woman he married was a prostitute and had continued prostitution after they were married. And so he would often espouse hatred toward all of womankind, and especially the prostitutes.
He was an unpleasant character. He used to host dinners at which his great party trick was to pass round anatomical specimens in glass jars of female body parts, including uteruses. And Tumblety's name has been connected with the whole Ripper murders because he was a larger-than-life, unsavory character.
As London was shaken by the first 4 Ripper murders, investigators began to suspect that Francis Tumblety could be the killer.
Several of the medical examiners who looked at the mutilated bodies of the victims did comment that the killer seemed to possess some rudimentary medical knowledge. And we know that Tumblety was known in the States to have performed at least one abortion that went fatally wrong, and was wanted by the police in both the US and Canada for passing himself off as a fake doctor.
There is no doubt that the London police viewed Francis Tumblety as a key suspect. They looked at his attitude towards women. They looked at his desire to be taken seriously as a surgeon and his odd collection of uteruses, and they believed that Tumblety could have been Jack the Ripper.
According to London police records, Tumblety was questioned about the Ripper murders, but he was ultimately released for lack of evidence. Then, shortly after the Ripper's 5th and final victim, Mary Kelly, was murdered, Tumblety left London and returned to New York City. Some historians believe that the timing of these events is no coincidence.
When Tumblety first arrives in London, right after he gets there, the Ripper murders begin. And right after he leaves, they stop. While we don't know exactly where Tumblety was or exactly what he was doing, there was a woman who ran a lodging house at 22 Batty Street. And that is about a 10-minute walk from each of the crime scenes. She had a lodger, and she referred to him as an American doctor. There were rumors that she had found a bloody shirt after this lodger had returned late at night, covered in gore. And then the lodger took up new residence at the Charing Cross Hotel. The day after the last Ripper murder, the lodger from the Charing Cross Hotel disappeared without paying his bill, but left behind a small black doctor's bag. Once it was turned over to the police and the contents were examined, inside they found some herbal medicines, some clothing, a little bit of jewelry, and some pornography, which Tumblety is known to have sold. Now, it's hard to know for certain because this is just a theory. But based on the timeline and the nature of this individual, it is quite possible that he could have been involved in the Ripper murders.
The London police may have had trouble proving that Francis Tumblety, the so-called American doctor, could have been Jack the Ripper. But upon his return to the United States, the press had no such trouble convicting him in the court of public opinion. And many people came to believe that Tumblety was the real Ripper.
There was an interview with Tumblety that appeared in newspaper reports on the 29th of January 1889, the year after the murders, when he's actually interviewed by a reporter who puts it to him that he's Jack the Ripper. And his replies are very, very interesting. He claimed it's the only reason the stupid English police arrested him is because he's American. And in his own words, the killer wore a slouch hat according to descriptions, and he said, "I wore a slouch hat." And so there's an accumulation of what one might call circumstantial evidence with regard to Tumblety.
Is it possible that Francis Tumblety was Jack the Ripper? Many researchers believe the evidence is compelling. And as proof, they point to a curious object that was in Tumblety's possession when he died.
When Tumblety died in 1903, he was in hospital run by nuns in St. Louis. And certain things were found on his person, which included a plain brass ring, almost like a curtain ring. And the only Ripper victim who actually lost anything of a substantial nature was Annie Chapman, and she'd had such a ring, a plain brass ring, stolen off her finger by the killer. So with regard to Tumblety actually being Jack the Ripper, for a lot of people now, he's the favourite Ripper suspect.
London, England, August 1888. Over the course of 9 harrowing weeks, the city was rocked by a series of horrific murders committed by an unknown killer. The scene of these terrible crimes was a neighborhood of London known as Whitechapel.
This one smallish area of the East End of London, Whitechapel, was a magnet for not only the very poor people, people who had menial jobs, for example, but also the actually destitute, the people who had reached the very bottom rung of the ladder, who had nothing but the clothes they stood up in, often. And basically, you had domestic violence, theft, and murder.
Whitechapel was an area where you had a lot of homeless drifters. You had what were known as the common lodging houses. And this is where the drifters ended up. It cost 4p for a common lodging house. You paid it to the keeper of the lodging house, and then you could get your bed.
4p sounds like a very small amount of money, but if you had nothing at all, it was quite something. Society had very stringent rules about women earning or having money. So many women turned to prostitution as a way to make ends meet in those days, because there was literally nothing else for them to do.
If you look at Whitechapel in the late 1800s, you have women who would not normally engage in prostitution, sometimes hawking their bodies, to make any kind of money, just to get perhaps a bed for the night. So these would be high-risk victims, under the cover of darkness, going with people they don't know into dark, remote areas of alleyways, becomes highly dangerous for them, very low risk for the offender. It's a deadly combination for these women.
In the early morning hours of August 31st, 1888, 2 delivery men were walking to work in Whitechapel when they made a gruesome discovery. They found the body of 43-year-old Mary Ann Nichols lying dead on the bloody pavement.
Mary Ann Nichols had been married, had children, but her marriage had fallen apart through alcoholism. By the early 1880s, she had turned to sex work in order to earn her living.
When Mary Ann Nichols' body was found, at first it looked like a simple murder. Her skirts were up as though she was committing an act of prostitution at the time she was killed. That's not particularly unusual for London in its day. However, when the body made its way to the coroner, and further investigation was carried out, they found that this was a murder and a mutilation. And that raised some questions.
Just 8 days after the murder of Marianne Nichols on September 8th, 1888, the body of another woman, Annie Chapman, was found lying in the courtyard of a Whitechapel tenement.
Annie Chapman had previously been married to a man named John Chapman, but they separated, and then eventually she found that he'd died. She had tried selling items and taking in crochet work, that sort of thing, to support herself. But eventually she became more and more reliant on casual prostitution to get her money for a nightly bed.
When Annie Chapman's body was found, there was no doubt that a horrible mutilation had taken place. And now it made police begin to wonder whether these two horrible acts 1 week apart in the same part of the city could well have been done by the same twisted individual.
This is a killer who hated women and wanted to do maximum damage to them. So it immediately gives off this sort of cinematic image of this sinister character in a black coat going through the London fog, walking on cobblestones at night.
The notion that a predator was targeting sex workers in the Whitechapel district set off a frenzy in the London newspapers.
There were 158 daily newspapers in London, and they were all in competition for sales. So when the press got a hold of this case of murders, it was exactly what they needed for the new readership that they were trying to get. You have to remember, at the time these murders were taking place, the Sherlock Holmes mysteries were the best-selling thing on the planet. And everybody wanted to sink their teeth into a nice, juicy mystery.
Unfortunately, in the late 1800s, we see a real effort from the media to let a cult of personality form. And as much as we abhor violence and murder and killing, there are some ways in which the serial killer becomes this sort of folk hero of psychological deviance that terrifies and intrigues us. It's a delicate balance to make sure we're not glorifying something that really shouldn't be glorified.
The media drove the horrific nature of the crimes in a sensationalist way. Whitechapel was obviously depths of degradation and poverty, and yet it was literally 2 streets away from the Bank of England, which was headquarters of the empire at that time. And so that became very quickly a national issue and a national concern.
In the aftermath of the 2 brutal murders, the London police were unable to identify a prime suspect. As a result, they chose to cast a wide net in their search for the killer. More than 300 people were placed under investigation, and 80 of them were brought in for questioning.
Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who was head of the investigation from Scotland Yard, wrote a report at that time saying that the potential suspects ranged from the highest in the land, Queen Victoria's grandson, right down to East End butchers and slaughtermen.
There was no shortage of candidates. There were all sorts of people, from Sir William Gull, Queen Victoria's physician, to her grandson, Prince Albert Victor, or somebody acting on his behalf. Even Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. Largely on the grounds that he lived at the London hospital, which was quite near Whitechapel. So there are vast numbers of candidates being put forward, some laughable, some quite plausible.
As the police scrambled to identify the man who murdered Marianne Nichols and Annie Chapman, the vulnerable residents of Whitechapel braced themselves for more attacks by the unnamed killer.
On the streets and corners of Whitechapel, the reaction to the murders changed drastically with the discovery of the second victim, and it led to the creation of watch groups patrolling the streets of East London. Poor women were on high alert. Vigilante groups formed in order to find out who this murderer was.
London, England, September 27th, 1888. 3 weeks after newspaper headlines announced the brutal murder of Jack the Ripper's second victim, Annie Chapman, the city remains gripped by fear. As police investigators frantically round up possible suspects, a mysterious letter arrives at London's central news agency that appears to be from the killer himself. It is written in red ink, riddled with spelling errors, and, strangely, begins with the words, "Dear Boss."
The Dear Boss letter is addressed to the Boss Central News Office, City, or London City. And it read, "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talked about being on the right track. I am down on whores and shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." And it really became a big news story because of that line.
The Dear Boss letter concluded with the words, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper."
The Boss letter is interesting because it is the first letter apparently having been written by Jack the Ripper, where he gives himself a name, communicating with the public. This is not an unknown phenomenon with serial killers, because it makes them feel superior. There's sort of this narcissistic view of them being so much smarter than law enforcement. I can do what I want, and you are not going to identify me.
The Central News Agency handed the Dear Boss letter over to police investigators, who decided not to release it to the public for fear of inciting even more panic throughout London. But then, 2 days after the letter had been received, on September 29th, the Ripper struck again. And this time, he killed 2 women in a single night.
On the night of 29th of September 1888, 2 women were murdered in the same night, within an hour of each other, less than a mile apart. Elizabeth Stride was murdered in a yard on Burner Street. She was found lying on the ground with her throat cut, but no mutilations. And then half a mile away, within the hour, Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square. Her throat was cut, and she was terribly mutilated. And the feeling is that the Ripper was interrupted in the killing of Elizabeth Stride. So he fled the scene, but his lust for blood wasn't sated, so he sought another victim, found Catherine Eddowes, and killed her in Mitre Square.
After Jack the Ripper claimed his 3rd and 4th victims, the police had no choice but to publish the Dear Boss letter in the desperate hope that the public could help them find the killer. But unfortunately, the letter did little to solve the case. Instead, it caused the fear across London to actually increase and ensured that Jack the Ripper's infamous name would go down in history.
Part of what made that letter horrifying is that it was understood to have been written and mailed before the murders were committed, anticipating them. When the murders occurred, it thus, for many, confirmed that the Ripper manipulated the media in order to gain attention for his gruesome crimes.
But curiously, not everyone is convinced that Jack the Ripper was the real author of the Dear Boss letter. In fact, some believe that the letter was actually an invention of the media.
There was a very famous journalist at the time called George Sims, and he used to write a column for a Sunday newspaper called The Referee. It was called the Mustard and Cress column. And George Sims actually wrote in the column the following week that the Dear Boss letter was written by an enterprising London journalist. And effectively, his argument is, when that letter was sent, the hysteria in the media and the general fear of the Whitechapel murderer had started to die down. And there is a theory that a newspaper man thought, we need to get more sales. So what better way to get sales? We'll get a letter from the killer.
The Boss letter was released by the police to the public. Now, they were hoping that somebody might recognize the writing style or the handwriting itself, but all it did was really complicate the investigation, because then you had hundreds of people writing in the same style as Jack the Ripper, claiming to be Jack the Ripper, claiming to know who Jack the Ripper was.
The Dear Boss letter encouraged readers and people out there to send in their own letters signed Jack the Ripper, most certainly from hoaxers, people just looking to waste police time. And every single letter, no matter how ridiculously it seemed at face value, had to be looked into by the police.
Most of the letters sent to the police were dismissed as hoaxes. But some experts believe that despite the skepticism, the Dear Boss letter was, in fact, written by Jack the Ripper himself. And as evidence, they point to a passage in the letter detailing a trophy he would take from his next victim.
The Dear Boss letter read, "Next time I operate, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send it to the police." And consequently, within 24 hours, and the police now found the horrifically mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes. And the killer had cut the earlobes as well.
Do Catherine Eddowes' nicked earlobes prove that Jack the Ripper wrote the infamous Dear Boss letter? More than 130 years after the letter was sent, there's likely no way to be certain. Yet, modern forensic experts studying the Dear Boss letter have used it to help develop a criminal profile of Jack the Ripper. And it paints an extraordinarily dark picture of the shadowy killer.
We know that there were almost no sightings of Jack the Ripper. And even in the sightings that existed, the descriptions are very vague. So you're left with behavior. He's organized and he's engaged in planning. That requires a slightly older individual. This is a guy who probably prefers to be by himself. So his job would probably entail a job where he can work by himself, isolated. Could be a hospital worker, could work in maybe a butcher shop, or work as a mortician's assistant. I think he lives in the Whitechapel area because he's very familiar with the routines of the police, and that's why he's a successful killer.
London, England, November 9th, 1888. As the city gathers for its annual Lord Mayor's Day celebration, the caretaker of a tenement in the Whitechapel district peers through an apartment window and makes a gruesome discovery. He finds the savagely mutilated body of Jack the Ripper's fifth victim, 25-year-old sex worker Mary Jane Kelly.
When he looked through, he found an absolutely horrific spectacle. He saw a massive pile of bloodied flesh lying on the bed, on the bedside table, almost unrecognisable from Mary Kelly.
The murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the last known Ripper victim, it was different for some reasons from the others. One is that Mary was the only full-time prostitute among the canonical victims. The other is that it happened indoors. She rented her own place, although she was incredibly behind with the rent. 29 shillings, that was a lot. She was seen with a man, actually, shortly before she just disappeared forever into the house. And this man came and tapped her on the shoulder and said something, and they both laughed and walked off. And she obviously invited the man into her room. But sadly, there were no details about the man.
The murder of Mary Jane Kelly marked the first time that the London police took photographs of a crime scene. It was such a horrific attack that there was a new determination to catch Jack the Ripper before he struck again.
The city was in an uproar. They were calling the police incompetent, that they couldn't catch this guy. I think one of the reasons that they took photographs actually at the scene is that they recognized there's some dynamic here we need to capture. They were under a lot of pressure to solve these cases, identify this individual. I think anything that would help them to do that was going to be in their best interest.
The use of crime scene photography in Mary Kelly's murder investigation was an invaluable tool for detectives trying to identify Jack the Ripper. But why weren't pictures taken at the scene of the previous 4 murders? Well, according to one theory, it could have been due to a conspiracy to conceal the Ripper's identity because he was potentially a member of a powerful secret society known as the Freemasons.
Freemasonry has its origins in England. It's a secret society based on the Enlightenment values of the liberal arts and sciences. Individuals who are Masons, they're not just this small group of guys who are sort of on the sidelines. These are prominent individuals.
Freemasonry was rampant through the establishment of Victorian England. There were Freemasons absolutely everywhere. Through the royal family, through the government, through the aristocracy, through the church, through local councils, and in the police, of course. If Jack the Ripper had been a Freemason, in particular if he had been a member of an influential lodge, it's more than likely he would have been protected.
But what evidence is there to suggest that Jack the Ripper was a Freemason? Some researchers point to a curious message left near the murder scene of Jack the Ripper's 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes.
When the police were called to the horrendous discovery of Catherine Eddowes' body, according to the description in police records on the wall nearby, somebody had written, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." But Jews are spelt J-U-W-E-S. The spelling kind of summoned to mind Jubila, Jubilum, and Jubilo, who were 3 legendary assassins in Masonic law.
According to Masonic ritual, these 3 men, Jubilo, Jubila, Jubilum, killed the chief architect of King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago because of the city's wickedness. And their murder of the chief architect is reenacted in Masonic rituals as part of the Master Mason ritual. And so the spelling of Jews was the thing that really struck the police as a deliberate misspelling that's meant to mean something central to Masonic belief.
Could Jack the Ripper have scrawled the graffiti message to let other Freemasons know that he was a member of their secret society? It may sound far-fetched, but incredibly, the actions of the lead investigator in the case suggest that this theory could be true.
During the course of police investigation, Charles Warren, the London police chief, took the controversial and rather odd decision to wipe the graffiti off the wall. Now, why did he do that? Maybe one of the reasons is that Charles Warren, as a Freemason, saw this on the wall and thought, oh no way am I having these murders in the East End connected to Freemasonry, and so he wiped that off.
There's a lot of people who say the connection between Jack the Ripper and the Masons was that the Masons orchestrated the murder of the prostitutes who were blackmailing a member of the royal family. Prince Albert Edward Victor, who's Queen Victoria's grandson, the heir presumptive to the throne of England. In a nutshell, the theory is that Prince Albert Edward Victor did frequent brothels, and he'd had a child by a girl named Annie Elizabeth Crook. And she told a particular group of prostitutes her secret, and they then set about blackmailing the royal family.
The speculation seems far-fetched, but so the Jack the Ripper murderer unfolds during a mania for what is called slumming, when wealthy elite people went to the precincts of the poor on a night out to enjoy themselves at dens of iniquity, sites of prostitution. And East London was famous for the dangerous proximity of both wealth and sexual exploitation.
According to the royal family conspiracy theory, the Freemasons were then brought in to murder the prostitutes who were blackmailing the royal family. Consequently, that's why police were made to erase the graffiti and to take away any suspicion from the Masons.